Hi everyone, this is week 4, and this week we are looking at some sociological investigations into what was often considered technical or natural disasters, but sociologists went in and were able to discover that there were actually really strong social causes for what happened, the way things played out. So what we're going to talk about are two sociological tools for evaluating problems. So we've already talked about the sociological approach to social problems, where you have to create a narrative, you have to make claims, you need claim makers, you need to get legitimacy. And today we're going to look at how do sociologists go in and investigate things like natural disasters or organizational problems and show how there's actually social causes to these issues. This will help uncover how um, other claims makers are trying to describe problems to avoid culpability or blame, and the ways that sociologists go in and investigate. So we're going to look at the Chicago heat wave with Klinenberg, who talked about denaturalizing disasters, and the um, Challenger disaster with Diane Vaughan, who talked about the normalization of deviance and the anatomy of a mistake. So, starting with denaturalizing disaster, Klinenberg said he's offering a loose model for denaturalizing disasters that are generally constructed in a vocabulary that effaces or masks or hides their social logic. And he argues that what happens is it avoids looking at these three social processes. First is the social and political context that surround those who are vulnerable. Two, how the state determines vulnerability. And three, how state actors like politicians and the media erase social and political causes. So let's look at what Klinenberg did in evaluating the Chicago heat wave. This comes both from the article you read as well as his book called Heat Wave, The Social Autopsy of a Disaster. Just as a quick refresher, in 1995, there were 5 days of really intense heat that was deadly. The heat index, which measures the combination of weather, heat, and humidity, said that the heat that you were feeling and experiencing was up to around 150 degrees Fahrenheit. And in those 5 days alone, up to 739 people died. It might have been more. Most of them were elderly. Most blacks were more likely to have died than whites, and Hispanics were the least likely to die. But 740 people in 5 days is pretty, in especially in 1995 was pretty big or pretty large. Um, Klinenberg is an urban sociologist. He looks at how urban or city areas are complex social systems and how the social life interacts with organizations and the way the city is organized, etc. So, what did he see in Chicago's heat wave? Um, in his book, he identifies five things that most people miss. First, that there was a politically savvy coroner who was able to avoid pushing this as a political issue or a social cause, a mayor and the press who were trying to make Chicago look amazing and avoid any negative reputations, social isolation of vulnerable populations, segregation, and city agencies, programs, and policies that were not well developed for disasters. Um, in his autopsy, which he called a technique for opening up the skin of a city and determining which of its institutional organs had broken down, he argued that there was an aging population of urban residents who were likely to live alone, increasing spatial concentration and separation, and then the government agencies best positioned to redress the inequities did little to actually help. So he looked at what are these social agencies, what are these government programs that were supposed to help, and why did they fail? So he argued that there were four problems with our approach to social protection. First, there was an organizational mismatch. What the heat wave required was a lot of health and supportive services, but these were delegated to the police and fire departments, which were not trained for soft service work. Police are to deal with crime and violence. Fire departments are to deal with actual fires. They are not necessarily equipped or trained to deal with health, climate, etc. And so there was the needs of this disaster were not met with the organizations that were trained or equipped to deal with it. Second, there was a false expectations that city residents would be smart shoppers, so to speak. City officials assumed that the public would look for the services that they needed and that they would be proactive in, okay, there's this, it's 150 degrees. What services does the city offer? Instead, Klinenberg argues that city residents should be seen as citizens that are entitled to social protection and proactive assistance by the city, that the city should have gone out to educate the citizens about what was available and see what people needed, but they did not do that. Third, that there's been an ever increasing distance between the leaders of the city and those who are disadvantaged. This is a picture of Mayor Daley. Chicago and many cities have increasing bureaucracy, so that if you need assistance from the city, then you're not likely to interact with the mayor herself, but you're more likely to interact with someone who's, 20 levels below her as in some bureaucratic organization. This increasing distance between the disadvantaged residents and leaders makes it so that leaders and those who are making decisions aren't sure how best to organize the city government for the disadvantaged. And finally, the news and politics failed to address the social realities for two reasons, he argues. First is that there's been an economic pressure to make news more entertaining. So it was much more entertaining for audiences if you talked about, this dramatic heat source that no one could have predicted. And there's been a rise of delivery systems that target specific audiences. And so many of the newspapers that were, getting quotes and information from the city were not targeting the disadvantaged, and those that were disadvantaged might not have been getting the news at all. So this is showing that the heat wave could have been much, much less of a disaster if the politicians were, focused on the who was vulnerable, how to tailor city services to the vulnerable, and if afterwards they would have reflected specifically on the social organization of the state and the relationship to the vulnerable. Klinenberg says that he finds support that this is more of a social disaster rather than a natural disaster, because less than a year afterwards, there was another large heat wave, and the city of Chicago had done a lot to revamp its response to heat, and very few people died in the next heat wave. And so he's like, so clearly this was more of a state failure than a natural disaster. Now let's go to the Challenger disaster. Diane Vaughan wrote about this as the anatomy of a mistake. So this is kind of similar to doing a social autopsy. And she focused on normalizations of deviance. And what she's looking at is organizations that are involved in risky procedures or risky conditions. This could be construction. This could be flight. What I'm trying to remember the last book she did. air traffic controllers, it could be hospitals, surgeons, etc. That all of these people are making decisions under uncertainty. But the organizations themselves are focused on individual decision making rather than the organizational system and how that leads to mistakes or big problems like a gigantic explosion. So she argues, and we'll get to this at the end, there are three targets to avoiding organizational disasters, looking at political policy decisions, organizational culture, and recognizing signals of danger. So the Challenger disaster, as a brief overview, was in 1986. There was a push by the Reagan administration to commercialize space flight, and they wanted to make it exciting. However, they were doing so many shuttle launches that people stopped tuning in. People weren't as excited. And so the Reagan administration and NASA decided, well, let's send up a civilian. And specifically, let's send up a teacher to kind of excite students about spaceflight. And so they had this big sweepstakes where teachers applied, they were trained, there was, finalists. And finally, there was a specific teacher who was named, and she went through a training regimen to become an astronaut, and then was going to be on the Challenger to go up into space, do like lectures to her elementary school kids in space, and kind of, excite the country about space flight again. 75 seconds after the shuttle launched, there was this what looked like a massive explosion, and the shuttle fell to Earth. 7 people died, all of the passengers on the space shuttle. And immediately the idea was, oh, it was just a technical failure. One of the O-rings was destroyed, and maybe there was a bad decision by some middle managers, but that's it. And what you can watch this on your own, but the Reagan administration, the House of Representatives commissioned multiple investigative committees, and this is what they find what they argue is that engineers argued you need to delay the launch. Directors never heard about that because middle management didn't relay concerns, and it was bad decision making on middle management. However, Diane Vaughan goes in and says this is not how it went. We need to look at other things that are going on both outside of the organization within. So first, she argued that NASA had changed by privileging speed and cost effectiveness over scientific exploration and safety. So this was seen in a couple ways. First is they started outsourcing who created the rockets. This was and this is very common throughout all of government services today, contracting private companies. They had a bidding war between companies who would secure the contract, and NASA chose the company that scored the worst on all aspects, including safety, but gave the cheapest budget. Then, in terms of speed and cost effectiveness, by the 1970s, there were scientists who were saying O-rings aren't great technology, and that's the piece that failed in the shuttle, and that we should replace it. But the leadership of NASA ignored this repeatedly, saying it would be too expensive to research and change the mechanism of the shuttle. Political pressures, as I explained, there was this desire for routine launches, and they had already delayed the specific launch, and the vice president was supposed to be there, and so they didn't want to delay it again, even though it was super cold, and they had never, launched in super cold atmosphere before. And so this political pressure to be more like a business and more of a commercial, exciting thing rather than scientific exploration really put a lot of pressure on the organization as a whole. So these are kind of the overarching political and social contexts that lead to how there was some organizational deviance within NASA. She calls this the social organization of a mistake, or the anatomy of a mistake, and she identifies three organizational characteristics that really produced the circumstances for this explosion: production of culture, culture of production, and structural secrecy. Production of culture is what she calls the normalization of deviance, which we'll get into in a bit. But the first time that the space shuttles used O-rings, the engineers gave highlighted concerns, especially when these launches were happening in cold temperatures. But nothing happened. There was no explosion, there was no problem, and so they decided as an organization that this was an acceptable level of risk to take. That since there were all of these times when the O-rings did not fail and there was not an explosion, then it was fine. And so it became cultural knowledge that this was an acceptable level of risk when temperatures might cause concerns about the O-rings. So over time, they continued making these risky decisions, even though, or because they had so many times in the past when it had worked. Second, the culture of production is something we described previously, that many engineers and scientists were adopting the standards and norms of needing to launch often and always, we can't delay, we need to go. And even though the reports that the Reagan administration and the House of Representatives Commission said that the engineers had raised alarms and the middle managers didn't listen, Diane Vaughan sees that only 3 out of the 14 engineers who worked on the project actually objected to the launch, because these engineers had largely adopted the norm of, no, we need to launch, we need to keep on schedule, otherwise we might lose our jobs. And then finally, she talks about structural secrecy, that organizational leaders, the decision makers were managers rather than scientists. And so they didn't really necessarily understand the technical aspects. And so engineers needed to, create these kind of pseudo-scientific symbols of when risk was acceptable or not, simply to get the management to sign off, but also alert them of problems, but couch them in a way that was acceptable and be like, don't worry, this has happened so many times. So rather than having people in power who were actually technically proficient and understanding the actual risk, the engineers would make shortcuts to kind of vaguely describe what was happening to make sure things would proceed smoothly. Let's get into normalization of deviance a little bit. Remember, this is the production of culture, how a culture was produced within the organization. She says that the social normalization of deviance means that people within the organization become so accustomed to deviant behavior that they no longer consider it as deviant, despite the fact that they far exceed their own rules for the elementary safety. And so what we're looking at here is a kind of the deviation spiral. So in the center of this, there's the thing called the original normal. This is how the standards of safety would have started. And then you see kind of directly afterwards, there was a deviation. In this case, it was they accepted the risk of the O-ring. There was no failure. And so that became the new normal. The O-ring might have, they thought the O-ring would fail in a little bit colder temperature, but there was no failure. So now there was this normal of, oh, the O-rings are even acceptable in really cold temperatures. And then deviation 3 maybe was really hot and there was no failure. And so now there's this idea that, oh, the O-rings are fine in any temperature, which leads to a disaster in the end. So it was less about the O-ring itself and more about the organizational acceptance of deviance and risk. Now, is this the only time this has happened? No. So this is research has suggested that in organizations this is fairly common, where deviant behavior becomes so routine it is seen as um, normal and the way things go. Um, in 2012, there was a crash of an Italian cruise liner called Costa Concordia. Um, and they said that Carnival's directors not only tolerated but promoted and publicized the risky activities that the captain was doing. In 2010, there was a report on anesthesiologists, and that there was such pressure that it has become a reality for many anesthesiologists to act in unsafe or to do unsafe actions. And this report estimates that this normalization of unsafe actions has resulted in at least 400,000 deaths per year. The report says that that number of patient deaths is equivalent to 22 Boeing 777 jets with 350 passengers and crew crashing every week in a year with no survivors. That's how many people die because of the normalization of deviance within anesthesiologists. Now, let's take it to COVID-19 and the vaccine rollout. We see on the left, the darker areas are where COVID deaths were concentrated, and that was largely on the west and south sides, which is largely Black or Latino areas. Yet the neighborhoods that had the highest vaccination rates were the white areas. And so the Chicago vaccine rollout did not match the people who were most affected by COVID-19. And so using the tools that we just looked at, we could either think of this, how would we go in and do a social autopsy? What are the social and political contexts of vulnerable people in Chicago? How does the city government determine vulnerability? And how is the city government, providing a narrative that erases their own culpability or the social and political causes? Or we could also look at the normalization of deviance within the city government or within the vaccine organizations. What are the policy decisions that have led to a pressure to put vaccines in white areas? What is the organizational culture to ignore the needs of the poorer residents or the residents of color? And what are some signals of danger that is being overlooked? So let's bring this back and think again about how social problems have to have a subjective component, right? There has to be a narrative to this. In the Chicago heat wave, the politicians and media's narrative was that this was a natural disaster. There's no way we could have known. Whereas Klinenberg points out that there was actually a social cause to that disaster. And if the city government had taken vulnerability seriously and treated its citizens not like consumers, but as, entitled citizens to services, then many deaths would have been saved. In the Challenger disaster, the politicians and NASA created the narrative that this was a simple technical error and a bad decision by some middle managers. Whereas when Diane Vaughan went in there, she said, no, there are a lot of issues here. There's policy decisions, there's political context. The culture of the organization is pressuring people to make risky decisions to the point that it's become normalized, and there are many signals of danger. And so this is what sociologists do, is we try to go in and uncover when has these problems of disasters actually had social causes so that we can create better social context to avoid future disasters like this. Hopefully this was helpful at seeing what sociologists often do, as well as looking at social problems in a more concrete context. This is the end of section 1. Next week, I think we are going into crime and how crime has been what the narrative of crime in the US has been, and what are the competing narratives for that as a social problem. If you have any questions on this week or in the future, please let me know. Feel free to email me at any time, and I look forward to your work this week. Thank you.